Fairness is a concept manufactured by people who have never had to divide a pile of money. In my line of work, as a commercial property inspector, I deal with structural integrity. I look for the hairline fractures in the foundation that everyone else ignores because the facade has a fresh coat of paint. I know exactly how much weight a load-bearing wall can take before it gives way. Families, I've realized, are no different. They operate on a series of silent agreements and structural compromises until someone decides to pull a support beam just to see what happens. I stood in the foyer of my father's lawyer's office, tracing the grain of the mahogany wainscoting, and realized I was the only one in the room who knew the building was about to shift. The office of Miller and Associates was designed to project an image of timeless stability. It smelled of expensive leather and air filtration systems. My father, Leonard, sat at the head of the conference table, his posture as rigid as the high-back chair supporting him. At 72, he still carried the aura of a man who owned the air he breathed. To his right was my mother, Ruth, her hands folded neatly over a designer handbag, her face set in a mask of practiced concern. And then there was Colin. My younger brother sat across from me, fiddling with an expensive watch, his eyes darting toward the window as if he had somewhere more important to be. Colin was a tech reseller, a middleman who lived on margins and charm, and he had always been the golden inhabitant of the Brooks household. "Evan, thank you for coming," Leonard said. His voice was gravelly, a sound that usually commanded immediate compliance. He didn't look at me, he looked at the leather-bound folder in front of him. "We wanted to do this in person, to avoid any confusion later." "I appreciate the clarity," I said. I kept my voice neutral, the same tone I use when informing a developer that their parking garage has significant drainage issues. I sat down and opened my own notebook. I didn't plan on taking notes, but a pen in hand serves as a shield. The lawyer, a man named Holloway who looked like he had been preserved in salt, began to read. It started with the boilerplate language of estates, trusts, executors, the mundane architecture of wealth. But then the numbers began to emerge. The family home in Greenwich, the portfolio of commercial holdings in the valley, the liquid assets. It was a staggering sum, the culmination of 40 years of Leonard's aggressive acquisitions. As Holloway read, the room grew heavy with the weight of what was being given away. Regarding the primary residence and the associated liquid holdings, totaling approximately $300 million, Holloway continued, his voice monotone, the distribution is allocated in full to the Colin Brooks Family Trust. The air didn't leave the room. It stayed right there, thick and stagnant. I watched Colin. He didn't look surprised. He didn't look guilty. He looked relieved, like a man who had just been told his gambling debts had been erased by a stranger. My mother reached over and patted his hand, a gesture so reflexive it felt rehearsed. "And for Evan?" I asked. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't lean forward. I simply waited for the structural report. Holloway cleared his throat. "The estate provides a one-time disbursement of $50,000 for the purpose of educational funds for your children, Evan. Beyond that, the remaining assets are committed to the primary trust. $50,000. In the world of Leonard Brooks, that was an insult disguised as a gesture. It was the price of a mid-range sedan. It was the amount of money you gave to a distant cousin you hadn't spoken to in a decade." I looked at my father. He finally met my eyes, and I saw the calculation there. He expected me to shout. He expected me to point out that I was the one who had spent my weekends helping him manage his early properties while Colin was away at summer camps. He expected me to claim I was being treated unfairly. "Is there a reason for the disparity?" I asked. "It's practical, Evan," my mother said, her voice soft, pleading for a peace she hadn't earned. "Colin has expansion plans. He has a vision for the family legacy. You have your own career, your own firm. You're stable. You don't need the burden of managing these types of assets." "The burden," I repeated. I let the word hang in the air. I thought about the $300 million burden and how Colin's version of a vision usually involved burning through capital to look successful rather than actually being successful. I looked at the paperwork Holloway was sliding across the table. It was a summary, but behind it sat the full schedule of assets, the dirty details of the foundation. "I see," I said. I stood up and walked to the window. From the 12th floor, the people on the street looked like data points. My father was watching me, his jaw set. He wanted the explosion. He wanted me to prove I was the difficult son so he could justify the choice he'd already made. But my job isn't to explode. My job is to observe the cracks and determine the cause of the failure. "You're not going to say anything?" Colin asked. There was a hint of a smirk on his face, the arrogance of a man who thought he'd already won the race because he was standing at the finish line when the gates opened. "What is there to say?" I replied. I turned back to the table. If this is how Leonard wants to structure his legacy, that is his prerogative. I'm a professional, Colin. I understand how contracts work. I walked back to the table and picked up the stapled packet of summary documents. Beside it lay a thick, blue-covered folder, the full valuation report. I saw Holloway reach for it, but I was faster. I tucked it under my arm along with my notebook. I'll take these to review, I said. That's the internal audit, Evan, Holloway said, his hand hovering in midair. The summary is all you need for your records. I'm sure my father doesn't mind if I see the math, I said, looking directly at Leonard. Unless the math is something I'm not supposed to understand? Leonard waved a dismissive hand. He looked tired now, the adrenaline of the betrayal fading into the reality of a long afternoon. Let him have it. It's just numbers, Holloway. He's an inspector. He likes numbers. Thank you, I said. I felt the weight of that blue folder. It felt different than the summary. It felt like leverage. I walked out of the office without saying goodbye. I didn't hug my mother. I didn't shake my brother's hand. I walked through the quiet hallway, the carpet muffling my footsteps, and entered the elevator. As the doors slid shut, reflecting my own calm, middle-aged face back at me, I felt a familiar sensation. It wasn't anger, it wasn't even sadness. It was the focused, cold clarity that comes when I find a massive structural flaw in a building that everyone says is perfect. I reached my car in the parking garage and sat in the driver's seat. The silence was absolute. I opened the blue folder. I ignored the glossy photos of the properties and the glowing descriptions of the family's wealth. I went straight to the schedules, the lists of liabilities, the liens, the encumbrances. I knew how my father worked. He was a man of shadows and handshakes. He would never give Colin $300 million without ensuring that the money was tied to something that Colin couldn't easily dismantle. As I flipped through the pages, my eyes stopped on a line item for a commercial holding on 4th Street. It was a warehouse I had inspected 10 years ago. Back then, it was a liability, a crumbling brick box with environmental issues. But here, in the official valuation, it was listed as a primary asset with a clean title and a massive appraised value. I frowned. I remembered that building. I remembered the oil seepage in the basement and the way the owner had tried to hide the records of the chemical spill from the 80s. I remembered telling my father that the property was a legal nightmare waiting to happen. I turned the page. There was a signature on a waiver regarding the environmental liability. It wasn't my father's signature. It was a digital stamp from Colin's reselling firm. I sat back, the leather of the car seat creaking under my weight. I looked at the date on the waiver. It was from 6 months ago. They had moved the liability into a shell company to inflate the value of the main trust, making the inheritance look far larger and more stable than it actually was. They hadn't just cut me out. They had built a house of cards and were planning to let Colin sit on the top floor while I was left on the sidewalk. But there was a problem with their math. A very specific, very expensive problem. If that liability hadn't been properly remediated, and I knew for a fact it hadn't been, then the entire valuation of the estate was fraudulent. The lenders involved in the trust's liquidity would have a very different opinion of Colin's vision if they knew the foundation was resting on a toxic site. I tapped my pen against the steering wheel. I could go back upstairs. I could demand a seat at the table. I could plead for my children's future. But that was the old Evan. The new Evan, the one holding the blue folder, realized that the best way to handle a failing structure isn't to try and patch it while everyone is still inside. The best way is to step back, file the report, and let the laws of physics do the rest. I started the engine. I had a lot of reading to do, and I knew exactly which public records offices would have the original filings for the 4th Street property. My family thought they had handed me a $50,000 consolation prize. What they didn't realize was that they had handed me the one thing I knew how to use better than any of them, the truth about how things fall apart. I pulled out of the garage and into the bright, indifferent light of the afternoon. The city looked the same as it had an hour ago, but for me, the landscape had shifted. I wasn't the disinherited son anymore. I was the inspector of record, and I had just found a crack that went all the way to the bedrock. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp concrete and exhaust, a combination that usually settled my mind. I stood on the roof of a mid-rise medical plaza in the suburbs, the wind tugging at the edges of my high-visibility vest. In my world, everything has a physical consequence. If a drain is blocked, the roof ponders and eventually sags. If a bolt is over-torqued, it shears. There is a brutal honesty in engineering that I have always found more comforting than the fluid, shifting morality of my family's dinner table. As I moved my moisture meter across the membrane of the roof, my mind wasn't on the potential for leaks. It was on the blue folder sitting in the footwell of my truck 3 stories below. I spent the next 4 hours doing what I do best, looking for the things people want to hide. I checked the HVAC units, the seismic bracing, and the fire suppression lines. I recorded every deficiency with a clinical detachment. This is how I have lived my life, observing the slow erosion of standards and documenting the results. It was the same way I had observed my brother Colin for 40 years. I had watched him slide through private schools on the strength of my father's donations, watched him pivot from one failed business venture to another, always landing on a cushion of family capital. He was a master of the veneer. He looked like success, spoke like success, and smelled like success. But he had no load-bearing capacity. When I finished the inspection, I sat in my truck and opened my laptop. I didn't go to the office. I didn't call my wife to complain about the meeting. Instead, I accessed the county's digital archives. As a licensed inspector, I have access to certain tiers of property records that aren't immediately visible to the casual browser. I pulled up the history for the 4th Street warehouse. The records confirmed my memory. 10 years ago, the site had been flagged for soil contamination. The remediation costs had been estimated in the low 7 figures. My father had bought it anyway, buried the report in a subsidiary, and let it sit. But the new valuation in the blue folder, the one that underpinned the $300 million trust, claimed the site was unencumbered. To achieve that status, someone had to have filed a certificate of occupancy and a clean environmental clearance. I looked for those filings. They existed, but the signatures were digital, tied to a third-party consultancy I didn't recognize. My phone buzzed in the cup holder. It was a text from my mother. "Evan, your father is very stressed after yesterday. Please don't make this harder than it needs to be. We are a family." I didn't reply. The word family was being used as a silencer, a way to muffle the sound of the foundation cracking. Instead, I thought back to a summer 20 years ago. I had been working for my father's firm, actually doing the labor, while Colin was given a title and an air-conditioned office. I had found a structural issue in one of our residential builds, a literal gap in the frame. I told my father. He told me to focus on the big picture, and had a different crew cover it with drywall. That was the moment I realized that in the Brooks household, truth was a secondary concern to appearance. I quit the next day and started my own inspection firm. I chose a life where a gap in the frame is a documented fact, not a matter of opinion. 3 days later, the news broke within the family circle. My father had suffered a significant cardiac event. He wasn't gone, but he was incapacitated, confined to a high-end recovery wing where the machines did the work his heart no longer wanted to do. My mother called me, her voice trembling, not with grief, but with the sheer panic of a woman whose primary source of power was suddenly offline. "He's stable," she whispered over the phone, "but Colin is having to handle everything at the office. It's so much pressure on him, Evan. He's trying to finalize the trust distributions, and the banks are being very difficult." "I'm sure he's doing his best," I said. I was standing in my kitchen, watching the rain streak the windows. "He needs the files you took," she said, her voice sharpening. "The blue folder. Holloway says it's an internal working copy, and it's causing a delay in the audit because the physical trail is broken. Just bring it over to the house. Please, be the bigger person for once." "I'm still reviewing it, Mom," I said calmly. As a property professional, I have a fiduciary interest in ensuring the assets assigned to my children's educational funds are backed by accurate valuations. I wouldn't want the $50,000 to be tied to a devalued property. There was a long silence on the other end. I could almost hear her calculating the risk of arguing with me. "It's $50,000, Evan. It's a rounding error. Don't be petty while your father is in a hospital bed." "I'll be over to see him tomorrow," I said, and hung up. I didn't go to the hospital to see my father. I went to the hospital to see the man who was running the estate in his absence, Holloway. I found him in the cafeteria, looking gray and overworked. He tried to mask his annoyance when I sat down across from him, but the way he gripped his plastic fork gave him away. "The family is in crisis, Evan," Holloway said. "This is not the time for an audit." "It's exactly the time," I replied. "I've been looking at the 4th Street warehouse, the environmental waiver, the one signed by Colin's firm. It's missing the underlying laboratory countersignature. That makes the valuation of the entire commercial pool technically unverified. If the lenders see that, they'll freeze the bridge loans Colin is counting on to fund the trust." Holloway's eyes narrowed. He was a smart man. He knew exactly what I was saying. He also knew that as a family member and a professional in the field, my formal inquiry into the records would trigger a mandatory hold on the proceedings. "What do you want?" he asked. "I want the full estate files," I said. "Not just the summaries. I want the valuation work papers, the debt schedules, and the correspondence with the environmental consultants. I want to see how deep the cracks go." "I can't do that without Leonard's consent." Leonard can't give consent, I reminded him. And Colin is the one who signed the waiver. If I go to the Board of Auditors with a formal discrepancy report, the whole estate goes into a legal deep freeze for years. My mother wouldn't like that. Colin certainly wouldn't like that. Holloway looked at his salad as if it held the secrets of the universe. I'll see what I can release. But Evan, you're playing a dangerous game. You're part of this family, too. Am I? I asked. Because the paperwork I saw 3 days ago suggested I was an afterthought. I left him there and went home. I spent the evening in my home office, a space defined by order and precision. I didn't feel the rage that most people would expect. I felt a strange, quiet satisfaction. It was the feeling an architect gets when they realize they've identified the exact point of failure in a bridge before the first car drives over it. I wasn't destroying the family. I was simply refusing to lie about the state of the structure. A week passed. Colin did not call me. My mother's texts became increasingly frantic, then stopped altogether. The silence was a signal. It meant the banks were starting to ask the same questions I was. When an estate of that size is in transition, the lenders are like sharks. They can smell a discrepancy in the water from miles away. I continued my daily work. I inspected a shopping mall, a warehouse, and a parking structure. I moved through the world of physical reality, where facts are stubborn and gravity is absolute. Every time I climbed a ladder or checked a load-bearing beam, I felt more grounded. My brother was currently trying to navigate a world of paper and promises, but I was rooted in the tangible. On Friday, a courier arrived at my door with a package. It was from Holloway's office. Inside was a digital drive containing the full valuation files I had requested. There was no note, just a formal transmittal slip. I plugged the drive into my computer and began to scroll. It was worse than I thought. The 4th Street warehouse wasn't the only issue. There were 3 other properties where the liabilities had been shifted, hidden, or outright ignored to create a phantom net worth that didn't exist. My father had been a master of the shell game, and he had taught Colin how to move the cups, but they had forgotten that someone eventually lifts the cups to see where the ball is. I spent the night cross-referencing the internal files with public records. By 4 a.m., I had a clear picture of the disaster. The estate was leveraged to the hilt. The only way the $300 million distribution to Colin worked was if the valuations remained unchallenged. If even one major property was downgraded due to environmental or structural issues, the loan-to-value ratios would fail. The banks would call the notes. The vision would vanish. I looked at the screen, the blue light reflecting in my glasses. I had the power to stop the entire process with one phone call to the estate auditor, Marla Keene. I could report the discrepancy as a concerned party with professional standing. I thought about my children and the $50,000. I thought about the way my mother had patted Colin's hand in that office. I thought about my father's silent, calculating eyes. They had built their world on the assumption that I would always be the quiet one, the one who stayed in his lane and accepted the crumbs because I was stable. I reached for my phone and dialed a number I had saved years ago. It wasn't the auditor. Not yet. It was a man named Gordon Pike, a senior representative for the primary lender that held the liens on my father's commercial pool. Gordon and I had worked together on several industrial assessments. He trusted my judgment. Evan? Gordon's voice was thick with sleep. It's early. Is everything okay? I'm fine, Gordon, I said, my voice steady and professional. I'm calling because I've been reviewing some files on the Brooks estate. I think there's a valuation discrepancy on the 4th Street asset that your risk department might have missed. I'm looking at an environmental waiver that doesn't match the county's historical filings. There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. The sleepiness was gone. Are you sure? I'm an inspector, Gordon, I said. I'm always sure about the foundation. I hung up the phone and leaned back in my chair. The sun was beginning to rise, casting long, thin shadows across my desk. I knew what would happen next. The gears of the financial world would begin to turn, slowly at first, then with an unstoppable momentum. The audit would be paused, the distributions would be halted. Colin's expansion plans were about to meet the reality of a frozen asset. I felt no need to celebrate. There was no joy in it, only the deep, resonant satisfaction of seeing a crooked line finally being straightened. I closed the laptop and went to the kitchen to make a pot of coffee. The house was quiet. The structure was sound. And for the first time in my life, the weight was exactly where it was supposed to be. In my profession, there is a specific kind of silence that occurs just before a structural failure. It isn't a total absence of sound. It is a series of microscopic pings and groans as the material reaches its limit. To the untrained ear, a building in distress sounds like a building settling into its skin. To me, it sounds like a countdown. After my call to Gordon Pike, The silence surrounding the Brooks estate took on that exact quality. It was the sound of a $300 million framework beginning to buckle under the weight of its own inaccuracies. I spent Tuesday morning at the county recorder's office. While most of the world has moved to digital databases, the truly inconvenient truths are often buried in the physical overflow, the paper records that haven't been scanned because they are considered legacy data. I moved through the stacks of ledger books and manila folders with the practiced efficiency of a man who knows that paper never forgets. Digital files can be edited, timestamps can be manipulated, but a physical stamp from a municipal clerk in 1994 is a permanent scar on the record. I found what I was looking for in a misfiled box of industrial zoning variances. It was the original geotechnical report for the 4th Street warehouse. The digital version I had seen on the drive Halloway sent me had been cleaned up. 3 pages of soil samples had been omitted, specifically the ones showing a high concentration of chlorinated solvents. The original document, sitting in a dusty box in a basement, was far more descriptive. It didn't just suggest a problem, it mapped a plume of contamination that extended beneath the neighboring properties. I sat at a wooden table in the archive room, the fluorescent lights humming overhead. I felt a strange sense of alignment. My father and Colin had gambled on the idea that no one would ever look at the original blueprints of their lies. They assumed that because I was the practical son, I would be satisfied with the superficial layers of the estate. They were wrong. My practicality is exactly what makes me dangerous. I don't care about the intent of the builder. I only care if the building stands. By Wednesday, the microscopic groans became audible. My phone began to vibrate with a frequency that suggested a systemic collapse. Colin called me 6 times in 2 hours. I didn't answer. I wanted him to live in the silence for a while. I wanted him to experience the feeling of a foundation shifting beneath his feet without knowing where the support had vanished. Instead of returning his calls, I met with Marla Keene. Marla was the estate auditor, a woman whose reputation for precision was legendary in the local real estate circuit. We met at a nondescript diner halfway between the city and the suburbs. She had a stack of files in front of her and a look of weary intensity. "Evan," she said, skipping the pleasantries, "I received an inquiry from the lender this morning. They've placed a temporary hold on the capital release for the Brooks Trust. They cited an unverified environmental waiver." "I imagine that's a significant complication for the distribution timeline," I said, sliding the photocopies of the original geotechnical report across the table. Marla put on her reading glasses. As she scanned the pages, her expression didn't change, but her posture stiffened. She was seeing the same thing I had seen. The discrepancy wasn't a clerical error. It was a deliberate omission. "This is a serious matter, Evan," she said softly. "If these samples are accurate, the valuation of the 4th Street holding is off by at least 40%. And because that property is cross-collateralized with the rest of the commercial pool, the whole house comes down. I'm just an inspector, Marla. I saw a crack and I reported it. The rest is for the auditors to decide. You realize what this does to your brother's position? He's already signed contracts for 3 new acquisitions based on the assumption that this capital would be liquid by the end of the month." "In my industry," I replied, "we call that building on uncompacted fill. It's a recipe for a cave-in." I left Marla with the documents and went back to work. I had a job in the city, a final walkthrough of a renovated office complex. The developer was a nervous man who followed me around with a clipboard, jumping at every scratch I pointed out. I found myself feeling an odd sort of sympathy for him. He was worried about aesthetic flaws while my own family was currently watching their entire reality dissolve into a puddle of chemical runoff and bank inquiries. That night, I realized I needed one more piece of the puzzle. The blue folder had mentioned a second set of records held at the 4th Street site office, a small auxiliary building that Colin used for his reselling business. If the remediation had ever been attempted, the logs would be there. If they weren't there, it meant the waiver was a complete fabrication. I arrived at the warehouse district at 10 p.m. The area was a grid of corrugated metal and chain-link fences, illuminated by the orange glow of high-pressure sodium lamps. The air tasted of salt and old machinery. I didn't need a key. I knew the security codes for all my father's properties. He had never bothered to change them, a testament to his belief that I was too loyal or too boring to ever use them. The small office building sat at the edge of the lot, a modular unit that looked temporary but had been there for a decade. I punched in the code, the electronic lock clicking open with a sound that felt unnecessarily loud in the stillness. Inside, the office smelled of stale coffee and toner. I didn't turn on the overhead lights. I used a small, high-powered flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness like a scalpel. I moved to the filing cabinets in the corner. Colin's filing system was a disaster, a mix of high-end tech inventory and estate paperwork scattered without logic. I searched for 30 minutes, my heart steady, my movements methodical. I wasn't a thief, I was an investigator. I was retrieving evidence of a structural failure. I found it in a bottom drawer, tucked inside a folder labeled Miscellaneous Maintenance. It wasn't a log of remediation. It was a series of rejected bids from 3 different environmental firms. Each one stated the same thing. The contamination was too deep for a standard cleanup. The final letter, dated only 4 months ago, was a stern warning from a consultant named Eris Thorne, stating that they could not, under any circumstances, issue a clean report for the property. Attached to that letter was a sticky note in Colin's handwriting. Keep this out of the master file. We'll use the 2012 digital template for the bank. I pulled out my phone and took high-resolution photos of every page. The evidence was absolute. It wasn't just a mistake or an oversight. It was a conscious decision to misrepresent a liability as an asset. My brother hadn't just been careless. He had been the architect of a fraud that was now the only thing keeping the Brooks family's reputation above water. I heard a car pull into the gravel lot outside. The headlights swept across the office walls, a bright, panning strobe that forced me to drop to the floor. I stayed low, my breathing shallow, the flashlight extinguished. Through the thin walls of the modular office, I heard the sound of a car door closing, followed by the crunch of footsteps on the stones. "I know you're in there, Evan." It was Colin. His voice was strained, vibrating with a high-pitched franticness I hadn't heard since we were children, and he had broken one of my father's trophies. I didn't move. I waited, counting the seconds. The footsteps stopped at the door. The handle turned, but I had engaged the manual lock bolt from the inside. "Evan, open the door. Holloway told me you were asking about the 4th Street records. What are you doing? You're ruining everything. Do you have any idea what happens if that audit fails? We lose the Greenwich house. We lose the firm. You're taking food out of your own niece's mouths." I stood up slowly and walked to the door. I didn't open it. I spoke through the wood, my voice low and resonant. "I'm not taking anything, Colin. I'm just documenting what's already gone. You spent the money before you had it. You built a life on a foundation of contaminated soil, and now you're surprised that the walls are cracking." "You're jealous," he screamed. "You've always been jealous because Dad trusted me with the future. You're just a glorified handyman with a clipboard." "The handyman is the one who tells you when the roof is about to fall on your head," I said. "You should have listened to the reports, Colin. You should have read the soil samples." I heard him kick the door, a dull thud that rattled the frame. Then, the sound of his breathing, heavy and ragged. He wasn't a threat. He was a cornered animal realizing the fence was higher than he thought. "If you walk out of there with those files, there's no coming back," he said, his voice dropping to a hiss. "Mom will never speak to you again. You'll be nothing to this family." "I was already nothing to the inheritance," I reminded him. "I'm just making sure the record is accurate." I waited until I heard his car speed away, the tires spitting gravel against the side of the warehouse. I stayed in the dark for another 10 minutes, letting the adrenaline subside. When I finally walked out, the night air felt incredibly clean. I drove to a 24-hour copy shop and printed 3 sets of the photos I had taken. One for Marlakeen, one for Gordon Pike, and one for myself. The audit wasn't just paused anymore. With the information I now possessed, the audit was about to become a forensic investigation. The lenders would pull their support by the end of the week. The bridge loans would evaporate. The Brooks estate, which had looked like a fortress only 7 days ago, was now a liability. I went home and sat on my porch. The neighborhood was silent, a collection of sturdy, well-maintained homes where people lived within their means and respected the laws of physics. I thought about the meeting in the lawyer's office and the way my father had looked at me. He had expected me to go away quietly, to accept the $50,000 and fade into the background. He hadn't realized that when you spend your life looking for flaws, you eventually become very good at finding the one that matters most. The estate was a structure built on a lie. And as any inspector will tell you, once the integrity of the primary support is compromised, it is only a matter of time before the whole thing returns to the earth. I wasn't the one who had destroyed it. I was just the one who had stopped pretending the cracks weren't there. The collapse of a financial reputation does not happen with a roar. It happens with a series of polite, terrifying phone calls. By Thursday morning, the atmosphere surrounding the Brooks family had changed from one of grieving stability to one of frantic, high-stakes damage control. I sat in a coffee shop 3 blocks from my father's corporate headquarters, watching the glass and steel tower through the window. From this distance, the building looked indestructible, a monument to the Brooks name, but I knew the spreadsheets inside were currently bleeding red ink, and the lenders were beginning to circle the perimeter. Gordon Pike had called me at dawn. His voice had lost its usual professional warmth, replaced by the clipped, precise tone of a man who was preparing to secure his own position. He informed me that based on my report, the bank had initiated a review of asset viability. In banking terms, that is the equivalent of a general contractor identifying a massive sinkhole beneath a foundation. Every cent of the $300 million intended for Colin was now frozen in a jurisdictional limbo. The bridge loans that Colin had used to secure his latest tech reselling acquisitions, loans predicated on the guaranteed arrival of that inheritance, were now being called for immediate reassessment. I finished my coffee and checked my watch. I had a meeting with the estate's legal overseer, Elaine Porter, but I was intentionally 20 minutes early. I wanted to see the chaos before it was sanitized for the conference room. I walked toward the building, my briefcase heavy with the copies of the hidden environmental reports. In the lobby, the tension was palpable. The receptionist, usually a picture of corporate poise, was juggling 3 lines simultaneously. I caught sight of Halloway in the elevator bay. He looked as though he hadn't slept in 48 hours. His suit was rumpled, and his eyes were fixed on the floor. He didn't see me, or perhaps he chose not to. In the world of high-value estates, an inspector who finds a flaw is often treated like a carrier of a contagious illness. I reached the executive parking garage, a place of silent, expensive machinery where my brother usually kept his pride and joy, a limited-edition Italian sports car that cost more than my first 3 houses combined. I saw him leaning against the driver's side door, his phone pressed to his ear. He was pacing a tight circle, his gestures wide and erratic. When he saw me, he froze. He ended the call abruptly and stood straight, trying to summon the old arrogance that had been his primary defense mechanism for 4 decades. "You really did it, Evan," he said as I approached. His voice echoed in the cavernous, concrete space. "The banks pulled the liquidity. My accounts are flagged. I've got creditors calling me every 15 minutes because the news of the freeze is already leaking." "I didn't do anything but read the documents you tried to hide, Colin," I said. I stopped 6 feet away from him, maintaining a professional distance. "If the assets were sound, a review wouldn't matter. You're angry because the math finally caught up to the marketing." "The math was fine," he snapped, stepping toward me. He was taller than I was, and he tried to use that height to loom over me, a tactic Leonard had used for years. "It was a timing issue. I just needed the distribution to clear so I could fund the remediation. I was going to fix it, Evan. I was going to make it right." "You were going to use a loan based on a lie to fix a liability you failed to disclose," I said. I didn't flinch. I looked him in the eye with the same neutrality I use when evaluating a cracked joist. "That isn't a strategy. It's a cycle of failure. You've been doing it since high school. Dad just kept paying for the patches. But Dad is in a recovery wing now, and the bank doesn't have a parental instinct." Colin's face twisted. For a moment, I thought he might actually try to strike me. I could see the frustration vibrating in his shoulders, the sheer helplessness of a man who had finally encountered a problem he couldn't charm or buy his way out of. But he knew, even in his panic, that any physical escalation would only accelerate his ruin. I was the one with the reports. I was the one the bank trusted. "You're destroying Mom's future, too," he hissed. "She's terrified. She doesn't understand why her own son is trying to bankrupt her." "She's not bankrupt, Colin. She has her personal holdings. What she doesn't have is the surplus you were planning to siphon off to cover your bad bets. If you were worried about her future, you shouldn't have forged a digital signature on a hazardous waste waiver." The silence that followed was heavy. The sound of a distant car engine hummed through the concrete levels above us. Colin looked away, his bravado finally fracturing. He looked smaller, his expensive clothes suddenly seeming too large for his frame. "What do you want, Evan? You want the money? Is that it? I'll talk to Halloway. We'll rewrite the distribution. You can have half. Just call Pike and tell him it was a misunderstanding. Tell him the reports were outdated." "It's not about the money," I said, and I realized as I said it that it was the absolute truth. "It's about the integrity of the record. You can't bribe a structural report, and you can't bribe me. The audit will proceed. The truth about 4th Street will be officially recorded. Whatever is left after the penalties and the remediation is what you'll get, not a penny more." I turned and walked toward the elevators, leaving him standing next to his overpriced car in the shadows of the garage. I felt a strange sense of weightlessness. For years I had carried the burden of being the lesser son, the one who worked for a living while the family's fortunes were built on a foundation of secrets. Now, that weight had shifted. It was Colin who was carrying the burden of the truth now, and he clearly wasn't built for the load. The meeting with Elaine Porter was a masterclass in bureaucratic coldness. Elaine was a woman who dealt in certainties. She had been appointed to oversee the reconciliation of the estate while my father was incapacitated, and she had no personal loyalty to the Brooks name. To her, the estate was a puzzle to be solved, and I had just handed her the missing pieces. "The documentation you provided is quite comprehensive, Mr. Brooks," she said, her glasses perched on the end of her nose as she flipped through my photos. I've compared these with the filings Halloway's office submitted. There are significant discrepancies. Discrepancies that suggest a deliberate attempt to misrepresent the value of the commercial pool. I am simply performing my duty as a licensed inspector, I said. Of course, she replied, her eyes meeting mine with a flicker of understanding. She knew exactly what was happening. She had seen family wars before, but she had rarely seen one fought with such clinical precision. I have notified the state's regulatory board. Because of the environmental nature of the 4th Street holding, we are required to notify the municipality. The property will likely be condemned until a full remediation is completed. And the impact on the trust? I asked. The trust is essentially insolvent until the liabilities are quantified, she said flatly. The lenders have issued a notice of default on the bridge loans. Your brother's personal assets, which were used as secondary collateral, are being frozen as we speak. I nodded. It was exactly what the math had predicted. There was no joy in hearing it, but there was a profound sense of closure. The system was working. The cracks were being measured, and the structure was being stabilized by the only thing that actually works, the law. As I left the office, my phone rang. It was my mother. I hesitated, then answered. Evan? Her voice was thin, stripped of its usual manipulative warmth. I'm at the house. Your brother is here. He's in a state, Evan. He says we're going to lose everything. He says you're doing this because of the inheritance meeting. I'm doing this because the inheritance was built on a lie, Mom, I said. I stood in the lobby, watching the busy professionals hurry past me, none of them aware that a $300 million empire was dissolving in real time. Colin tried to bypass the safety protocols. Now the whole building is being red-tagged. Please, she whispered, come over. We can talk about this. We can fix it as a family. There is nothing to fix, Mom. The reports are filed. The banks have the data. The time for talking ended when you and Leonard decided that my children's future was worth $50,000, while Colin's lies were worth $300 million. It was for the legacy, she cried. A legacy of contaminated soil isn't a legacy, Mom. It's a lawsuit. I hung up before she could respond. I walked out into the afternoon sun, the heat radiating off the sidewalk. I felt a sense of clarity I hadn't known in decades. My father was in a hospital bed, my brother was facing financial ruin, and my mother was finally forced to look at the cracks she had spent a lifetime ignoring. I wasn't the one who had brought the house down. I was just the one who had pointed out that the walls were already leaning. As I walked toward my truck, I realized that I didn't need the inheritance. I had something far more valuable. The knowledge that I was the only Brooks who could stand on his own 2 feet, without a lie to prop him up. The final phase was beginning. The social collapse would follow the financial one. The Brooks name, once synonymous with success, would soon be associated with environmental fraud and bank defaults. It was a fair trade. They wanted the prestige of the assets. Now they would have the reality of the liabilities. I drove home, the rhythm of the road steady and predictable. I had an inspection scheduled for the next morning, a small retail space in a good neighborhood. It was a simple job, a straightforward assessment of a solid structure. I looked forward to it. There is a specific kind of peace that comes from working with things that are exactly what they appear to be. Colin and my mother were currently living in a world of shifting shadows, trying to find a way to reframe the disaster. But I was done with shadows. I was moving back into the light, where every measurement is true and every flaw is documented. The revenge wasn't in the ruin. The revenge was in the refusal to look away. The drive to the family estate in Greenwich was a study in geological time. The further I moved away from the city, the more the landscape smoothed out into the curated rolling hills of old wealth. Stone walls, centuries old and perfectly maintained, lined the roads, structures designed to keep the world out and the secrets in. I had spent my childhood within those walls, never quite realizing that the mortar holding them together was made of nothing more than silence and a refusal to acknowledge the truth. As I pulled my truck into the long, winding driveway of my parents' home, I noticed the subtle signs of a lack of maintenance. A patch of unmown grass near the gate, a shutter slightly askew. The cracks were no longer just on paper, they were manifesting in the physical world. I stepped out of the truck and was immediately met by the silence of the woods. It was a heavy, expectant quiet. My mother was waiting for me on the porch. She looked fragile, her usual poise replaced by a frantic sort of energy. She was wearing a silk wrap that seemed too thin for the autumn air, her hands clutching a porcelain mug as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. She didn't wait for me to reach the steps before she started. "Evan, you have to stop this," she said, her voice a low, urgent thrum. "I've spoken to Halloway. He says the bank has initiated a full forensic audit. They're looking into everything, Evan, not just the 4th Street property." They're looking into the trusts we set up for you and Colin when you were children. They're looking into the foundations of our entire life. Then they'll find exactly what's there, Mom, I said, stopping at the base of the stairs. I didn't go up to her. I didn't want to be drawn into the orbit of her staged desperation. If the foundations are sound, the audit is just a formality. If they aren't, then the audit is a necessity. You talk like a machine, she snapped, the porcelain mug rattling against its saucer. This isn't a building inspection, Evan. This is your family. Your father is lying in a hospital bed unable to defend his name, and his own son is the one handing the shovel to the people who want to bury his legacy. I'm not the one who created the liability, I reminded her. I just refuse to ignore the report. There's a difference between causing a collapse and merely reporting that the support beams are rotten. I think you know that. In fact, I think you've known about the 4th Street issues for years. My mother froze. The wind caught a stray lock of her hair, but she didn't move to brush it away. She looked at me, and for the first time in my life, I saw the mask slip completely. It wasn't grief I saw, or even fear. It was a cold, calculating recognition. She wasn't the victim of Leonard's schemes. She was his partner. She had always been the one who smoothed over the rough edges of his ruthlessness, the one who made the unethical seem practical. We did what we had to do to ensure the family stayed at the top, she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. The 4th Street property was a mistake from the beginning, a bad acquisition Leonard made when he was young. We couldn't let it ruin everything else. We had to isolate the risk. We chose to protect the whole by sacrificing the detail. The detail was the truth, Mom, and you didn't just isolate the risk. You tried to pass it off as an asset to secure more debt. That's not protection. That's a shell game. And what do you want? She asked, stepping forward, her eyes narrowing. Forgiveness? Is that what this is about? You want us to say we're sorry for favoring Colin? Fine. We're sorry. We were wrong. Now call Gordon Pike. Tell him you made an error in your assessment. Tell him the 4th Street report was a preliminary draft and the final version shows the site is clean. If you do that, I will make sure the inheritance is restructured. You'll get your half. We can put this behind us. I looked at her, and I felt a profound sense of distance. She was still trying to negotiate, still trying to trade a lie for a favor. She thought my integrity was just a high-priced item on a menu. She didn't understand that for a man like me, the truth isn't a commodity. It's the only thing that keeps the roof from falling in. Forgiveness isn't a transaction, Mom, I said. And I don't want the money. I never did. I wanted a family that wasn't built on a foundation of chemical plumes and fraudulent waivers, but that's not what we have. What we have is a structure in terminal failure. You're a monster, she whispered. No, I said. I'm an inspector, and I'm here to collect the last of the records. I walked past her into the house. The interior was as opulent as ever, marble floors, antique tapestries, the scent of expensive lilies. But to my trained eyes, it felt like a hollow shell. I went to my father's study, a room paneled in dark oak where the air always felt 10 degrees cooler. My mother followed me, her footsteps sharp on the hardwood. I knew there were physical files Leonard kept, the real books. He was a man of his generation. He didn't trust everything to a cloud server he couldn't see. He kept the original correspondence in a floor safe beneath the Persian rug. I moved the heavy desk chair, rolled back the corner of the rug, and stared at the steel door. You can't go in there, my mother said, her voice rising in panic. That's private. That's Leonard's. I have a legal directive from Elaine Porter, I said, pulling a folded paper from my pocket. As a designated professional assisting in the estate reconciliation, I have the authority to secure all relevant financial and environmental records. If you try to stop me, the police will be here in 20 minutes to oversee the process. Do you really want the Greenwich police parked in your driveway while the neighbors are watching? She backed away, her face pale. I punched in the code, the same code he had used for the alarm, the same code he had used for everything for 30 years. He was a man of habit, convinced that his own cleverness was a sufficient shield. The safe clicked open. Inside were the ledgers, the actual history of the Brooks estate. I didn't need to read every page to know what was there. I saw the names of the consultants who had been paid to look the other way. I saw the internal memos where Colin had been coached on how to misrepresent the value of the commercial pool to the lenders. It was all there, a meticulous record of a life lived in the margins of the law. I began to pack the files into a heavy-duty storage bin I had brought from my truck. My mother watched from the doorway, her hands trembling. She looked like a woman watching her house burn down, unable to find the water to put it out. Where are you taking them? She asked. To Elaine Porter, to the auditors, to the reality you've been avoiding. He'll have nothing left, Evan. Your father will wake up to a world where he is a pariah. Everything he built, the name, the reputation, it will all be gone. He built it on uncompacted soil, Mom. It was never meant to last. I finished packing the bin and stood up. The weight of the records was substantial, a physical manifestation of 30 years of deception. I carried the bin through the house, my boots echoing in the grand hallway. As I reached the front door, I stopped. "There's one more thing," I said. I pulled a set of keys from my pocket, the keys to the 4th Street warehouse and 2 other properties that had been flagged in the audit. As of 3 o'clock this afternoon, these properties have been red-tagged by the city. No one is allowed on the premises. That includes Colin. If he tries to enter those sites to remove any more inventory or equipment, he'll be arrested for trespassing on a condemned site. I saw the last bit of strength leave her. She leaned against the doorframe, the porcelain mug finally slipping from her hand and shattering on the marble floor. Neither of us looked at the pieces. "I'll be at the hospital tomorrow," I said. "Not to talk about the money, just to see him." I walked out to my truck, the bin of files resting in the bed. I felt a strange, cold peace. The emotional pressure that had been building since the inheritance meeting had finally found a vent. I wasn't happy, but I was satisfied. The structure was being cleared. The debris was being moved. As I drove away, I looked in the rearview mirror. My mother was still standing on the porch, a small dark figure against the white pillars of the house. She looked like an architectural ornament that had lost its purpose. I realized then that the revenge wasn't about the assets or the betrayal. It was about the moment when the people who think they are untouchable finally realize that the ground beneath them is just as subject to the laws of physics as everyone else's. I reached the end of the driveway and turned onto the main road. The sun was setting, casting long, dramatic shadows across the landscape. The final reconciliation was scheduled for the following morning. Colin would be there. Holloway would be there. Elaine Porter would be there with her team of forensic accountants. And I would be there to deliver the final report. The Brooks family was about to learn that you can't build a legacy on a lie and expect it to hold. I had spent my life measuring the strength of materials, and I knew exactly how much stress this family could take. They were at the breaking point, and I was the one who was going to record the final snap. The conference room at Miller & Associates looked exactly as it had during the first meeting, but the atmosphere had undergone a total atmospheric shift. High-pressure systems create a certain kind of stillness before the storm, and as I walked in, I could feel the barometer dropping. This was the final reconciliation, the moment when the theoretical wealth of the Brooks estate collided with the physical reality of the audit. I took my seat at the far end of the table, placing my briefcase in front of me. I didn't open it yet. I wanted to observe the structural integrity of the people in the room first. Colin was already there, though he looked like a shadow of the man who had smirked at me weeks ago. His expensive suit seemed to hang off his frame, and his hands were tucked firmly beneath the table to hide their tremors. Across from him sat Holloway, whose usual composure had been replaced by a frantic, sweating desperation. He was shuffling papers, as if the right arrangement of staples could somehow negate the forensic evidence I had provided. My mother sat in the corner, distanced from the table, her eyes fixed on a point on the wall. She looked like someone waiting for an impact she knew she couldn't survive. Elaine Porter entered precisely at 9 o'clock. She was followed by 2 assistants carrying laptops and several thick binders. She didn't offer any greetings. She simply took her seat at the head of the table and opened her primary ledger. "This meeting is for the formal presentation of the estate's adjusted valuation," Elaine began, her voice as dry and brittle as old parchment. "Due to the discoveries made during the supplemental inspection of the commercial holdings, specifically the 4th Street warehouse and its subsidiary interests, the primary lenders have issued a full withdrawal of the bridge loans. The cross-collateralization clauses have been triggered." "Wait," Colin said, his voice cracking. "That's a temporary measure. We're working on the remediation plan. If we can just show them the revised timeline—" "There is no timeline, Mr. Brooks," Elaine interrupted, her eyes cold behind her spectacles. "The audit has confirmed that the environmental waivers were falsified. That is a breach of the fundamental loan covenants. The bank isn't interested in a timeline. They are interested in asset recovery. As of 6 o'clock this morning, the Brooks Family Trust has been placed into receivership." The silence that followed was absolute. It was the sound of a massive structure finally surrendering to gravity. I watched my brother. The color drained from his face until he was the same shade as the legal pads on the table. He looked at Holloway, but the lawyer wouldn't meet his gaze. Holloway was already calculating his own professional liability. "What does that mean for the Greenwich House?" my mother asked, her voice barely a whisper. "The house is listed as a secondary asset in the commercial pool," Elaine said. "It will be liquidated to satisfy the outstanding liens. You will have 30 days to vacate the premises and remove personal effects. The liquid assets, the $300 million discussed in the initial meeting, no longer exist." Once the environmental penalties and lender fees are deducted, the estate is projected to have a negative net worth. Colin let out a sharp, choked sound. He turned to me, his eyes wide with a mix of fury and disbelief. "You happy now, Evan? You got what you wanted. We have nothing. Your nieces have nothing. You burned the whole thing down because you were mad about a meeting." I stood up slowly. I didn't feel the surge of triumph he expected. I felt the quiet, professional satisfaction of a job completed. I opened my briefcase and pulled out the final inspection report I had prepared, the one that summarized the collapse not in emotional terms, but in numbers and facts. "I didn't burn it down, Colin," I said. I walked around the table and placed the report in front of him. "I just performed a load-bearing test. You're the one who built the house on a plume of solvents. You're the one who signed the fraudulent waivers. You didn't lose the inheritance today. You lost it the moment you decided that the truth was something you could edit." "We could have fixed it," Colin shouted, standing up so abruptly his chair tumbled backward. "We had the money. We had the name." "The name is currently being removed from the building signage on 4th Street, I replied. "And the money was never yours. It was the bank's, lent to you on the condition that you weren't a fraud. You failed the condition." I looked at my mother. She was finally looking at me, but I didn't see a mother's face. I saw a partner in a failed venture. She had spent 40 years maintaining the facade of the Brooks family, and now that the facade had crumbled, she had no idea who she was supposed to be. "The 50,000 for my children," I said, turning back to Elaine. "I assume that's gone as well?" "Every disbursement is stayed," Elaine confirmed. "The creditors take precedence." "Good," I said. "I wouldn't want a penny of it. My children will grow up in a house built with money that actually exists. They won't have to worry about the soil beneath their feet or the integrity of their father's signature. That's a better inheritance than anything Leonard could have left them." Holloway tried to speak, perhaps to offer some final legal maneuver, but I didn't stay to hear it. The meeting was over. The reconciliation was complete. The structure had been demolished by the sheer weight of its own deception, and the site was now being cleared for whatever comes next. I walked out of the conference room and through the lobby. I saw the maintenance crew already beginning to remove the Brooks Holdings lettering from the glass doors. It was a mundane sight, a man with a scraper and a bottle of adhesive remover. That was the reality of the Brooks legacy. It could be erased with a steady hand and a sharp blade. I reached the sidewalk and stopped for a moment, breathing in the cold, neutral air of the city. I thought about my father. I would go to the hospital later, but not to argue. I would sit by his bed and tell him that the 4th Street warehouse had finally been condemned. I would tell him that the records were in the hands of the authorities. I would tell him the truth, whether he could hear it or not, because the truth is the only thing that doesn't require a maintenance budget. My phone buzzed. It was a notification for my next job, an inspection of a new construction project on the north side. I checked the address, noted the time, and walked toward my truck. My gait was steady. My mind was clear. The revenge was not a spectacle. It wasn't a grand explosion or a dramatic reversal of fortune. It was simply the restoration of the natural order. A crooked line had been straightened, a weak support had been identified and removed. The world was a slightly more honest place than it had been an hour ago, and for a man in my line of work, that is the only outcome that matters. I started the engine and pulled into the flow of traffic. I didn't look back at the building. I didn't look back at the years of being the lesser son. I looked at the road ahead, where the lines were clear and the rules of the road were absolute. The Brooks estate was gone, returned to the ledgers of the banks and the files of the environmental agencies. I was Evan Brooks, a commercial property inspector, and I had just finished the most important assessment of my career. I drove toward the north side, the rhythmic sound of the tires on the pavement a steady, reassuring pulse. The foundation of my own life was solid, and as I reached for my clipboard to prep for the next site, I realized that I had never felt lighter. The weight of the family name was gone, and in its place was the simple, unburdened clarity of a man who has nothing left to hide. I parked the truck in front of the new construction site. It was a steel frame, open to the sky, its skeleton visible and unashamed. I stepped out, adjusted my vest, and picked up my flashlight. I had work to do. I walked toward the structure, my eyes already scanning for the first bolt, the first joint, the first honest measurement of the day. The system was in place, the audit was closed, and for the first time in 44 years, the building was exactly as strong as it appeared to be.